Hello, students. I'm here to present my lecture on precursors of the Romantic Revival. To start with, the term precursors of the Romantic Revival applies to the group of poets coming in late 18th century. These poets were dissatisfied with the ideas of wit and common sense and the tyranny of reason dominated by Pope and Dr. Johnson in 18th century. So they went against satire, realistic and urban culture, and too much of classicism and neoclassical trends in the poetry of the Augustan poets. These precursors loved poetry of a romance against poetry of reality. So there was the strong urge of romantic revival. The period 1740 to 1800 was covered by the middle and later stages of the 18th century, also usually known as the century of prose and reason, manifests some tendencies towards a new order of romanticism, a new mode of imaginative sensibility. This transition saw growing love for nature for its own sake and somewhat sentimental fondness for the countryside. The archaic literature forms such as ballad literature is a landmark history of this precursors of the Romantic movement. There was a great philosopher called Rousseau. He gave a call, return to nature. So this call saw an enlightened sympathy for the poor and oppressed. Even we saw a revolt against the conventional literary technique, particularly the heroic couplet, and a fresh treatment of romantic themes. In the later part of 18th century, we can see numerous cracks in the classical edifice through which seems to be peeping the multicolored light of romanticism. There we saw a large number of influence on English sensibility and temper, and this brought change in the very ethos of poetry, or we can say, in fact, literature as a whole. The young poets of this age started breaking away from the schools of Dryden and Pope, though some of the poets were still dangling between the old traditional influences and looking simultaneously at the neoclassical part and the romantic future. For them, we can say that they seem to be placed on the isthmus of middle state, to quote Alexander Pope. The change was to be seen in the selection of subject for poetic treatment, in choice of verse pattern. You know, the poets of the late 18th century who show some elements associated with romanticism, while still not ignoring the old conventions, are known as transitional poets or the precursors of the romantic revival. There are very popular poets like Thomas Gray, Robert Graves, etc., and some other poets also. These poets have got some romantic qualities into them. You can call these qualities as important features of the romantic revival poetry, just vice versa of the 18th century. Number one, the poems of precursors of the romantic revival are not altogether intellectual in content and treatment. Rather, these poets have valued passion, emotion, and imagination, and naturally return to the lyric. They believe in liberalism in literature, to quote Victor Hugo. These poets are not worried about rules and conventions. Rather, they believe in poetic imagination. Another feature in their poems, according to Hudson, is a love of the wild, fantastic, abnormal, and supernatural. Their poetry is not a drawing room or urban poetry like the poems of 18th century, but we see the recognition and appreciation of the world of nature. You know, nature was very much prevalent in 18th century poems too, but those were human nature. Here we are talking about natural beauty, the flora, the fauna, the beauty that God has given. For the romantic precursors of the romantic revival, individual became more important than society. Hence, the poetry became subjective. We also see their love and interest for the Middle Ages, and they are shown quite vividly, unlike Dryden and Pope. Last but not the least, the strong reaction in the precursors against the poetic diction, that is a heroic couplet of 18th century poets. They experimented with new measures and stanza forms. It is said that every hero ends as a bore, and same was the case with this heroic couplet. While summing up, we can say that these precursors are completely free from Popian influences. Sorry, not completely free from Popian influences. That's the reason they are not called full-fledged romantics, but transitional poets or precursors of the romantic revival. As the full flowering of romanticism came with the arrival of legendary William Wordsworth on the poetic horizon of English literature. Thank you.